Some histories remain not because a scribe has inked them onto parchment, but because battlefields themselves refuse to forget. The stones hold the sound of a tread, the air recalls the weight of a voice, and the dead, though silent, carry its memory into whatever lies beyond. Among such names is Rylanor, a figure whose story begins in the clear light of the Great Crusade, when the Third Legion still marched with unshaken pride and called itself the mirror of the Emperor's own perfection. He had not yet become a figure of legend, nor the shrine-bound relic he would one day be. In those first decades, Rylanor served as a line officer, a commander of squads and formations, distinguished not by theatrical flourishes or hunger for personal glory, but by the reliability of his judgment. Others sought the moment that would set them apart. Rylanor built his reputation brick by brick, through campaigns where victory was won by discipline, patience, and the unyielding application of force. By the time the higher echelons of the Legion took full measure of him, his worth was so evident that they entrusted him with a role meant to outlast the frailties of flesh. It was the war against the Eldari that would deliver him into that fate. On the translucent decks of an alien craft world, amid the blinding arcs of their shuriken weaponry, Rylanor's company fought against warriors who moved like the refracted light of their own crystal spires. In the chaos of blade and fire, a strike pierced his armor, rending him beyond the ability of mortal surgeons to mend. And yet, even as Medici raced to freeze his failing body into stasis, he kept the Legion's standard clamped in one hand, its cloth torn and burning in the alien wind. From that field he was born not to a tomb, but to a rebirth. The sarcophagus of a contemptor-patterned Dreadnought closed around what remained of him, grafting the will of a living man into a frame of adamantium and plasteel. The change was irreversible. He would never again walk as he once had. But within the Third Legion, such interment was a mark of immortal honor, granted only to those whose deeds were considered inseparable from the Legion's soul. From that moment, Rylanor bore the title of Ancient of Rites. That title was more than ceremonial poetry. The Ancient of Rites presided over the invocations before battle, oversaw the observance of the Legion's martial traditions, and spoke with an authority that bound together past and present. On the flagship Andronius, when the banners were hung and the warriors assembled in the Reclusium, Rylanor's voice, deep and resonant through the vox grills of his dreadnought form, rolled over the assembled Astartes like the tolling of some ancient planetary bell. His presence before an engagement was as much a weapon as any bolter or blade, for it reminded the warriors who they were and what the Emperor had shaped them to be. To Fulgrim, Rylanor was the living proof that the old virtues still lived beneath the Legion's newly gilded surface. The Primarch could point to the venerable Dreadnought as evidence that the Third still honored its origins. But Rylanor was no mute relic to be paraded for reassurance. He listened closely, watched the slow drift of discipline into indulgence, and marked the creeping arrival of vanity in the Legion's marrow. Even before the fateful campaign on Laren, he recognized the pattern, a perfection so enamored of itself that it could no longer tell the difference between refinement and decay. Encased in the shell that had saved his life, Rylanor stood as the one voice in the Legion that ambition could not drown. That voice would be tested until all else had burned away, and only his unbroken defiance remained. The campaign for Laren began as so many others had in the bright age of the Great Crusade. Summons issued, fleets marshalled, worlds targeted for compliance. Yet even before the first drop pod slammed into the alien soil, there was a subtle difference in the air aboard the Andronius. The Emperor's children were not simply on a mission of conquest. They were chasing a prize their Primarch seemed almost compelled to claim. Laren was no Imperial world waiting for liberation. It was a jewel of the layer, a Xenos species whose culture and craft had endured for ages beyond human record. The planet shone beneath the light of its sun, with seas like sheets of glass, and cities that curved as if grown from the bones of the ocean. The layer's mastery of form and symmetry appealed to the Third Legion's cultivated taste in a way that most alien holdings did not. Fulgrim's attention, always drawn to the beautiful, fixed on it as though the planet itself were a challenge. Rylanor prepared the rites as he always did, intoning the blessings over the armor and weaponry of his brothers. He watched them assemble, polished to a mirror sheen, movements measured to perfection. Yet beneath the surface, there was a restlessness, an eagerness that felt different from the disciplined zeal of earlier campaigns. He had heard whispers in the strategium, fragments of conversation about the strange relics uncovered by recon squads, objects whose curves and inlays could not have been wrought by human hand. When the order to attack came, the layer did not collapse as many human cultures had. They met the Emperor's children with weapons and war forms that were as much art as killing tool. Rylanor's Dreadnought frame smashed through their defensive lines, his autocannon spitting mass reactive shells that shredded alien constructs of chitin and coral. But even in the midst of the carnage, his helm lenses tracked his own warriors, how they lingered over the fallen relics, how their eyes followed the shimmering armor of layer champions as though they sought to remember every detail. Victory came, as it always had, but what returned to the Andronius was more than the spoils of war. Fulgrim himself carried back a singular relic from Lairen's depths, a blade of alien craft that caught the light in unsettling ways. There was pride in his voice as he spoke to his captains of the layer's artistry, of what could be learned from their pursuit of aesthetic mastery. The words were gilded with admiration, but to Rylanor they carried the first faint scent of danger, like oil on clear water. From that day, the Legion's perfectionism began to shift. Armor work became more ornate. The cadence of the pre-battle rites grew longer, more elaborate, almost theatrical. In the mess halls and armories, brothers spoke more of beauty, of sensory detail, of the subtleties of movement and form. Rylanor held to the old invocations without alteration, his deep vox voice refusing the ornamentations some began to suggest. In private, he counselled Sol Tarvitz, who shared his unease, to watch closely and remember the legion they had sworn to be. The change was not a fracture one could point to. It was a line beneath the surface, spreading quietly, waiting for a hammer blow to make it visible. That blow would fall at Istvaan. The fleet gathered above Istvaan III, as though it were preparing to conduct a textbook compliance. The coral city still glittered below, its spires intact, its streets flowing with the ordinary life of a world confident in its loyalty. The orders came down from the Warmaster himself, a precision strike to seize the seat of government, a swift decapitation of resistance. The Emperor's children would deploy alongside elements of the Death Guard, the World Eaters, and the Sons of Horus. The roster of the initial drop was drawn in the strategium days before. It was understood, without the need for elaborate explanation, that those assigned to the first wave were to be the spearhead of the operation. To the chosen warriors, it was an honor. To those who knew more, it was a sentence. Among those selected was Captain Sol Tarvitz of the 10th Company, a man Rylanor counted as both comrade and friend. No one can say whether it was instinct, foreknowledge, or the sum of all he had witnessed since Lairen, but Rylanor requested to take Tarvitz's place in the drop. On the surface, the decision could be justified, an Ancient of Rites lending his presence to inspire the warriors in the most dangerous phase of the assault. Yet there was something in the way he spoke to Tarvitz, a weight in the brief clasp of their hands, that suggested he already understood the true nature of the mission. The first wave slammed into Istvaan's soil under fire, pushing through the city's perimeter with methodical, legion-drilled precision. Rylanor's Dreadnought form led the advance, autocannon roaring, crushing barricades underfoot as he called orders over the Vox to Emperor's children's squads scattered through the streets. The defenders fought hard, but the discipline of the Astartes ground them down, driving them back toward the heart of the city. Then the signal came, not from the front, but from the ships above. The virus bombing began with a sigh in the air, a sudden, unnatural stillness. Warheads blossomed in the upper atmosphere, and the Life-Eater virus spilled downward like a tide of glass. The living choked, convulsed, and fell in moments. The dead ignited as the atmospheric ignition swept the world, turning oxygen to flame. Through that holocaust, Rylanor endured. His dreadnought shell sealed against the toxin, armor blackened by the firestorm, he rallied those few who had survived the opening betrayal. Death Guard, World Eaters, even Sons of Horus who had been on the surface, all drawn together in shock and fury, all recognizing the truth. Above them, their own fleets withdrew to high orbit, leaving them to be scoured from the planet. In the hours that followed, Rylanor became the keystone of the Loyalist defense. His voice cut through the ash and static, coordinating pockets of resistance across the ruined city, directing surviving armor into kill zones, shoring up collapsed streets into defensive lines. Every corridor of the Coral City was contested, every plaza turned into a place of execution for the traitor landing forces that came down to finish what the virus had begun. In the ruins of a world burning under its own sky, the Ancient of Rites became a warlord. The old invocations he had once spoken in the sanctity of the Andronius now became rallying cries shouted over the thunder of bolter fire, carrying not the promise of victory, but the certainty of vengeance. When the final bombardment ceased and the traitor fleets withdrew, Istvaan III was a wound that no physician could close. The Coral City's spires had collapsed into blackened stumps, streets were fissured and heaped with rubble, and every breath carried the fine ash of a billion dead. Those loyalists who still lived were not spared from the poison of the air, for even their sealed armor could not halt the slow degradation of time and hunger. Yet Rylanor endured. The Dreadnought frame that had once felt like a prison became his fortress. Its reactors provided power for centuries if needed. Its internal systems recycled the thin remains of oxygen. Its armor was proof against the scavengers and the few corrupted warbands who stalked the ruins. For the first months, he led the survivors as before, raiding abandoned armories, striking down any traitor squads reckless enough to descend from orbit in search of trophies. They fought not for the hope of relief, but to deny the enemy the satisfaction of an unchallenged victory. Inevitably, the numbers dwindled. Attrition was not swift, it was patient and absolute. Death came through the smallest breach in a seal, the snap of a ration line, the slow creep of infection in a wound no apothecary could treat. One by one, Rylanor's companions fell, and the vox channels that once brimmed with battle cant went silent. It was then that he chose the deeper places. Beneath the Coral City lay vaults, service tunnels, and forgotten bunkers where the ancient architects had hidden their reserves and reliquaries. He took his place among them, not to hide, but to wait. The centuries would become his weapon. The wreck of Istvaan III would be his hunting ground, and any enemy who set foot upon it would find him. Years stretched into decades, decades into centuries. Rylanor's mind, augmented by the life support casket, did not dim, though it felt the weight of time pressing on every memory. He replayed the betrayal, not as a wound to reopen, but as a stone to grind his will against. And always, the same conclusion returned. The one who bore the truest blame was Fulgrim, the Phoenician himself, who had allowed vanity to choke honor and had turned the Legion's blade against its own kin. From that conviction came purpose. If he could not save the Emperor's children from their fall, he would carve a wound into their Primarch that time could never heal. The ruin of Istvaan became his sanctum, his shrine to vengeance, and each decade that passed was a bead on the rosary of his patience. Deep underground, amidst the dust and silence, the Ancient of Rites waited. 10,000 years is an eternity to most. To Rylanor, it was a drawn breath, held until the day came to exhale it in fire. The day came as all long-awaited things do, without warning, yet exactly as imagined. It began with the tremor of landing craft breaking atmosphere, a vibration felt through the bones of the ruins rather than heard. Rylanor stirred from the darkness, servos grinding, dust sliding from his hull in pale sheets. His sensorium reached upward, scanning through layers of rock and wreckage, until the signals resolved into the unmistakable configuration of an Emperor's Children fleet. At its heart was a vessel whose signature he knew as well as his own, the ship that bore Fulgrim. The centuries in isolation had been spent in preparation for this moment. Buried deep within a gutted manufactorum lay a device of immense and terrible potency, a warhead of the same life-eater virus that had once scoured Istvaan clean. It was the last of its kind on the planet, preserved and armed through Rylanor's careful maintenance. its systems linked to the command interfaces built into his Dreadnought shell. This would be his lure. He sent the signal, not as a beacon of distress, but as a voice laden with challenge and defiance. Across the dead world, Vox relays crackled to life, broadcasting a single resonant message to the traitor fleet. The Ancient of Rites still lived, and he waited for his Primarch to answer for his crimes. Rylanor knew Fulgrim's pride could no more refuse such a summons than a blade could refuse to cut. The demon Primarch descended in full regalia, the once noble features of the Phoenician twisted into a serpentine splendor. His armor gleamed in unnatural hues, shifting as though the metal itself drew breath. His voice carried the silken cadence of the warp's false promises. He stepped into the shattered square where Rylanor waited, the two of them framed by the carcass of the coral city. Fulgrim spoke first, words heavy with mockery and the cruel indulgence of one who believed himself unassailable. Rylanor did not trade insults. His reply was the same voice that had once called his legion to honor, now sharpened into a weapon. "I am the Ancient of Rites," he declared, each syllable carrying through the broken streets. "I am here to pass sentence." The battle was brief in motion, yet eternal in meaning. Fulgrim's speed was inhuman, a blur of steel and talons, while Rylanor's blows were thunderous, each strike calculated to shatter. Warp light clashed against adamantium. The ground buckled under their weight. But this was not a duel to kill. It was a duel to hold the quarry in place, to keep the demon Primarch within the circle of the trap. When Fulgrim realized the truth, the warhead's arming sequence was already in its final breath. Rylanor locked his frame around the Primarch, forcing him to meet his gaze as the countdown reached its end. The Life Eater ignited in a surge of annihilating light, fire and toxin billowing upward to consume the square. In those last seconds before the blast tore him apart, Rylanor felt no triumph, no release, only the steady fulfillment of an oath kept across 10,000 years. The blast rolled through the coral city like the last breath of a dying god. Towers already broken sagged into final collapse, streets became rivers of fire, and the air turned to a churning haze of death. When the storm cleared, there was no sign of the Ancient's Dreadnought form, only a blackened crater at the heart of the square where two warriors had stood. Fulgrim survived. He staggered from the devastation, his demonic form scarred in ways that no warp-born regeneration could quite erase. It was not the kind of wound that could cripple flesh. It was the kind that lingered in memory, a mark that endured in the mind as much as in the spirit. In the centuries to come, those who served close to the Phoenician would speak, carefully, and never twice, of moments when his gaze turned distant, as though seeing something in the air before him. Always his expression would harden, and he would speak no more for the rest of that day. News of Rylanor's last stand did not travel through the Imperium as a public proclamation. It passed instead through quieter channels, among remembrances of the heresy who still lived, within the libraries of successor chapters who traced their gene seed to the third, in the private litanies of those few emperor's children who had remained loyal and were absorbed into other legions. They spoke of the Ancient, not as a martyr, but as a man who had lived long enough to choose the moment of his death and to shape it into a weapon. In certain halls far from Terra, there are still banners that bear his likeness, not in the pristine colours of the pre-heresy third, but in the scorched bronze and ash grey of Istvaan's ruins. Some have been carried into battle by chapters who never knew his voice, but who understand the language of defiance without needing translation. For them, Rylanor stands as a reminder that honour can survive in the dark, waiting, long after the world that birthed it has been reduced to dust. In the vaults beneath the ruins of the coral city, where light never comes and the dust lies undisturbed, there are still those who claim that sometimes, when the wind shifts and the rubble settles, one can hear a voice echo in the stone, not a ghost's wail, nor the restless moan of the dead, but the deep, unbroken tone of a vow spoken once and kept forever. And so, long after his body was consumed, the Ancient of Rites continues to serve.